Do you think we disagree on this?
And they are worthy of unsurpassable love. And that's all you're allowed to think about people.
Humans were created to enjoy and know God and to be known by him.
Don't cancel me. That's not really sacrilegious.
Hey Josh, you want to know something cool?
I love cool things.
So we're going to start a new series for our episodes, and we want to engage our viewers in what we're calling a theological primer.
Let's do it.
So what I mean by that is we want to study different topics in the field of theology, but we want to connect them for their relevance for our current social issues.
I'm in.
So we're going to start today with the doctrine of humanity or the doctrine of man.
Well, it's got to be humanity, otherwise you're sexist. So, doctrine of humanity.
This is true. Welcome, everybody, to Kingdom Thinking. Today we are going to start this new exciting series on theological doctrines, or how different biblical teachings connect and are very important for current events today.
Let's do it, man.
So, the human sense of wonder, or the inquisitive nature of asking, what's the meaning of all it? What's the significance of human life? It's not new. It didn't start with TikToks or IG pics or Throwback Thursdays or no filter selfie. You like that?
Yeah, dude. Okay. Good pop culture reference.
There you go. Back in ancient Near Eastern cosmologies or mythologies, to Greek philosophy, to even Enlightenment philosophies that have now kind of shaped a little bit of what our society is like. This sense of wonder and of wanting to know what's the significance of being human. That's been front and center of the human experience. So as we jump into that, we want to introduce the topic from a Christian perspective, in the hopes that we can shed some light on how this question is very much related to current events. We want to connect some dots for our viewers today on how we answer this question.
Yeah.
Okay? How we answer this question, what does it mean to be human, is a necessary starting point for Christians to engage in today's most divisive topics. So I'm just going to name a few. And I think that the conversations around politics, like immigration, abortion, LGBTQIA plus issues, BLM, and more, I think they should stem, if you're a Christian, from a theological or a biblical understanding of what does it mean to be human.
Awesome.
So the first thing we're going to do is give you some foundations for it. The second thing we're going to do is talk about areas of distinction between different Christian traditions. And then the third thing, which is the most important one, is, all right, so what? How does that connect to my life or to what I'm seeing on the news? So why don't you start us off with some foundations here?
Yeah, so briefly, we have to have this need to move beyond a fragmented view of humanity.
Okay.
Right? And this becomes incredibly important because humans have to be evaluated by efforts, merits, and actions, right? Because we are inherently more than machines. And so any type of reduction to this machine-like quality violates this exact thing that you're talking about, right? With needing to start with a full view of us as people. And so when we talk about being seen medically in terms of like our physical, biological, sexual needs, humans are the sum of those, but the sum, right, is greater, or the whole is greater than the sum on its own. Yeah. And so when we connect with those things, we have to have these viewpoints attached to us along with economic, social relationships, because it's important, right, that we have these guidelines and guardrails to stop abuse or power of abuse by people over some others. But there's value in understanding that, again, we're not just those titles, right? We are more than our race, our ethnicity, and things of that nature. And so our potential for choice and expression has to be celebrated and protected. But again, there's always this both and conversation happening here, that we are these things, but we are more than these things in and of themselves.
Okay. So if I may sum that up a little bit, we're illustrating 4 different possibilities or options to view humanity, and we're expressing their limitations, meaning these are necessary, but they're insufficient in and of themselves. So the 4 are, just to recap, what Millard Erickson, systematic theologian, calls this view of human as a machine, human as the product or the sum of his efforts, merits, accomplishments, etc. Like, you're going to get paid usually in proportion to how much you work or your negotiated salary. Your grades are based on your effort. These are good things, and they're important. but they don't quite encapsulate the total sum of what humanity is, right? And then like think just biologically, right? And this is going to get interesting at the end when we talk about like identity and things like that, but how you identify as your gender, or what your physical or biological needs are, or even limitations. If you think about paraplegics or even like mental limitations, those are significant. We shouldn't just say, oh, I see no handicaps, kind of like saying I see no color.
Right.
Like, no, don't be ignorant.
Right.
Like, you should see somebody for who they are, but they're more than their physical capacities or
Right.
limitations.
Right.
Third, and this is a really significant one, the social and economic position of humans. To say that that's not important would be silly. To say that somebody's class, social status, ethnicity, and or race doesn't play a significant role in who
it would
they
certainly
are.
seem to violate the Sermon on the Mount, right?
Exactly. However, a Christian perspective on what a human is means that you're more than
Right.
your social class. You're more than your relationship to the power structures in society, right? And I mean, that's going to rub some people the wrong way, isn't
Certainly.
it? But this is kind of where a necessary starting point, right? And lastly, celebrating something like choice and expression. I choose, therefore I am.
Sure.
My body, my choice, or I don't know, pick whatever slogan you want about the celebration of human independence. Like, yeah, that's cool. That's fine. There's probably something to that about protecting freedom and choice. Yeah. But there's more than that.
Right.
And so how do we move beyond these things? In theology, or in a biblical perspective, it's the image of God.
Yeah.
And this has to be the starting point for Christian dialogue and a perspective on how to engage social issues. So briefly, I'm going to give you a synopsis on this. The idea of the image of God in the creation account is what locates the identity and the why for humanity. In other words, we can talk about the social and economic positions of humans, and we should.
Right.
We can talk about the biological, sexual, etc. realities. We can talk about the choice, the protection, the merits, efforts. We should and can talk about all that. However, what brings all those together in a context that informs how Christians should see the world and their place in that world is why and for what. And the creation account labels that, or the narrator signifies and signals this for the reader.
Right.
And he says, it's the image of God.
Yep.
And so there's 3 different views on image of God. Can you take us through them?
Yeah, we have substance, which is a presence in human. We have capacity, which is a potential for relationship. And then we have function, which is the endowment of abilities, right? Such as the ability to reason, to create, and things that go with that.
Okay. And so, like, what do some of these mean to you in your own words?
Yeah, so for me, this is pretty interesting because I think of kind of the sharp distinction that occurs between Judaism and Christianity as a whole, right? And kind of Christianity's history with kind of being infused with Greek thought through patristic writings, and we become like these souls that have bodies, right? To kind of oversimplify a little bit, kind of over and against the Jewish thought, which is like we're bodies with souls, right?
Okay.
And so to me, it feels like it's a very, the Jewish perspective feels a lot more in line with how I think we ought to be kind of living out our Imago Dei feel, with this understanding of like, it's the whole of us that makes us valuable in the image of God, because it's the totality of us that's created in God's image, right? So this body that we have isn't something that we need to get away from, right? Like it's this, and I think we have a propensity to kind of fall into that trap a little bit, particularly in evangelical theology. And so for these 3 kind of things very, I think, profoundly encapsulate what I would tend to identify with Jewish thought, right? On that thing.
So you feel pretty good about it?
Yeah, I like them a lot because I think, language is limited. We know this, right? Like without getting too far into the weeds of like Derrida and Gadamer and things like that.
like language theory.
Yeah, like language has limits.
Yes.
So everything that we will be doing will be limited in, some capacity. But substance, capacity, and function feel like really good encapsulating terms to me to have this dialogue.
Good. And I don't think like these are exclusive.
Yeah.
I think that it's probably all of those, right? And so to understand, like, what does that actually mean? That the plants aren't made in the image of God.
Right.
The other creatures are not made in the image of God. The earth isn't made in the image of God. but humans are.
Yeah.
Like, this is such a fascinating mystery, right? And so
It almost feels like why.
right? The way that I taught this in like a Sunday school class, I taught it like if you could imagine, you know how like parents preserve their babies' like footprints and like paint or something like that? I taught it as like, imagine that God was putting his own fingerprints on us as a way of, now this metaphor isn't perfect, right? But it's a way of conferring authorship, of conferring the value and the dignity that eventually is going to say, or be an invitation to, you sit at my table. Why? Because I made you for this. The Westminster Confession of Faith puts it like this. It says that humans were created to enjoy and know God and to be known by him. And so I do think these things, so image of God as substance, meaning as this presence, this capacity to be indwelt by God. Okay, I think that's helpful. Image of God as a capacity, meaning image of God as a potential for relationship with God in a way that other creatures don't have, or image of God as function, meaning the capacity to reason, to be introspective, to create, and to have art. These are reflections of the image of God too. So, Josh, do all Christian versions of theology or traditions agree on all these things?
I don't know that there's really anything that we can find that most theological traditions
This is true.
on.
You can probably find traditions out there who'll disagree with like the Trinity or things like that. But
they're wrong, but you know, they're
right,
out there, sure.
Exactly. So what are some areas of distinction with reference to some of these image of God? Or
so we have kind of the composite nature of humanity.
Okay, what does that mean?
Right, as a whole. So basically there's a material and immaterial component to us as people. Okay. Right. And so there are things that we can touch, see, smell, sense, look at, you know, the things that are on the outside.
Correct.
Right? But there's also things like our spirit, our soul, right? Like that
emotions,
kind of language.
Mental capacities.
Thoughts, right? Like
are thoughts real?
The weirdness of our thoughts, that your brain is self-actualizing and analyzing and self-thinking about itself.
That's crazy.
Right? Yeah. It reminds me of the meme of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's like, dear God, it's me, you. There, right? And just like this conversation of like a bigger, you know, like kind of picture. Don't cancel me. That's not really sacrilegious. And so, right, the idea here, though, is that these parts are, you know, they're connected and they both need to be redeemed. Ultimately, is a bigger conversation to be having there. But it's like you can't separate the immaterial and the material. They are mutually inclusive with each other.
But this is so important. I mean, because if you think about this for a second, I think you're right that particularly in evangelicalism, it seems to me we emphasize the spiritual or the immaterial to the detriment of the physical. So we can talk about Christian spiritual formation. We talk about moral formation. We talk about saving souls. And I've even heard things like, well, God cares about souls, not bodies. And this could get really like Gnostic.
Dude. I mean, it moves us into this like docetic dualism, right?
Correct.
Where it's a fancy way of saying like the spirit great, body bad, right? Like Jesus is a spirit in a body, you know, but not really like a body.
And we need to be freed from.
We want to get above these types of things. And this is this Neoplatonic problem, right, that made its way into the early church fathers' writing, which then kind of impacted all of us.
Correct. And so we need to, I think, adjust and correct some of this. Not to the extreme of something like vanity or superficial views on the body and something like that. But, I mean, think about this. And, I mean, I'll go ahead and I feel comfortable saying this out loud. I mean, ever since I can remember in middle school, I've always been very much concerned with my physical appearance and my weight. Like that number has always meant something to me, and I don't know why, but it has. And so I've worked so hard because it tells me something about myself. To be a beefcake?
Yeah, dude. No you gotta look good for the lady.
I don't got the genes for the beefcake.
Sure.
And I think it speaks to something that both at its worst is harmful, but at its best is real. That I am not just my spirit. I am, like, this is a part of
God
who I
cares
am.
about your physical form and what you do with that. Right. How well you steward your body.
Well, not only that, but will I still be loved if I'm not in perfect shape? right? Is it okay that, if I'm a little soft in the midsection
Sure.
or whatever the case may be? Like that conversation about whether it's self-love or appearance or things has a rooted orientation in what it means to be human in
Yeah.
the image of God.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that people aren't worthy of being loved because of their appearance, but that their appearance is enough to be loved.
Yeah.
Right? Now, there's obviously balance to that. We don't want anybody to be unhealthy.
Sure.
I don't want anybody to be obese.
Right.
I don't want anybody to neglect their health.
Yeah.
But to be able to pastor
Well, and you're jumping right into like the body positivity movement, right? In this kind of thing where it's like you are worthy of love at any size that you are, right? Not because weight confers a certain value
Correct.
to it, but existence confers a value, right? Like because you are alive and breathing, you're worthy of love.
I think what I'm doing though is more that, and I don't know too much about the body positivity movement. I confess that, but it seems to me that certain movements like that are limited in you're worthy, so you should believe it,
Right.
And you confer that upon yourself.
Sure.
And I think with the doctrine of man, meaning the biblical teaching on how the Bible is expressing this is not only is your spirit and your body worthy of love because you should believe that, but it's because you were made.
Yeah. Because God declared it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that distinction is so important.
Yeah, for sure.
But back to this point, the Christian understanding of what does it mean to be body and soul, or body and whatever that immaterial part is, heart, spirit. I mean, Christians disagree on that, right?
Sure.
Do we have spirits and souls, or is spirit and soul the same thing? Without getting too much into the weeds.
Another topic, another day.
Right. Christians also disagree on human nature and free will.
Sure.
Right? So with the effects of sin, do humans choose God, or does God choose humans at the moment of salvation? Which one comes first? What are the effects and the consequences of sin? Meaning, has sinful nature marred or damaged every aspect of humanity, or can humans still do something that is substantially good? Christians disagree on that.
Yeah, certainly.
So as we move from, this is a kind of robust platform for understanding a theology of humanity, let's get into some of the so what.
Okay.
How would this change our perspective on certain social issues?
Oh man, it totally revolutionizes this, and this is something where like it upsets everybody on the political scale, right? Like this would be something that doesn't have a home in either political camp, which to me is usually like a good sign, right? But basically it helps us move beyond fragmented views, right? And this is what allows Christians to ourselves to move beyond an us versus them, right? Greg Boyd has this idea of like, if you don't know someone, right, like the only opinion you're allowed to have of them is that they are created in the image of God and they are worthy of unsurpassable love. And that's all you're allowed to think about people, right? Because that's what Jesus thought about them and, imparts that to us through his death and victory on the cross.
Nice.
And so this becomes a conversation around which we center everything, right?
Yes.
So it moves us into this idea of how we were made to be, right? And the value of ourselves that move out of that. So the image of God prioritizes the universal worth and dignity in the conversations about abortion, right?
Okay, so how would that change?
The mother's choice and the baby that exists inside the mother, right? It makes it far more complicated than this just the one-sided my body, my choice kind of conversation, right? Because it is your body, but your body is made in the image of God, and that image, right, has room in it to grow new life. And so there's a conversation that needs to be had about sacrifice, about not, exercising because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Like that kind of conversation comes out.
And at the same time, if it is so that we care about these lives, then it needs to be about the mother as well.
Certainly.
And maybe even our conversations about like sex ed move beyond just don't do it.
Yep.
Right? What does it actually mean to be in a relationship with somebody? I also heard another show is like, isn't it funny that we spend so much effort teaching people in school how to have sex or not, but we don't teach them how to be in relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. And so So one huge touch point there. Another one is immigration, right? This is probably the easiest one that devolves into us versus them there, because they're like an outsider in every sense of the word.
Physically.
Right? Yeah, physically outsider. They look different. They speak a different language, different customs, different food. Like there's almost no commonality here.
Correct.
Right? In some of these instances.
It's the easiest to feel threatened.
Yeah, certainly. And so, but if you view a sojourner or if you view an immigrant as somebody who's made in God's image,
would that change your perspective?
It should. Otherwise, you're not doing it, right? It's like all of a sudden they become just as valuable in the eyes of Christ as you.
Good.
And you're on completely equal ground.
So the question, who is my neighbor?
Yeah.
All of a sudden has a little bit of a different context.
It just extends far more than just the person on your block.
Exactly.
So war and economics, right? This is a harder
This
one,
is a
way
complicated
bigger than
one.
probably what we're going to solve in the next 10 minutes here. But who is the enemy?
Right.
This conversation around
how and when should we go to war?
right, if we should go to war,
right.
Is it better to like let people live the way that they want to live that's weird to us and not just try and like make an oil grab or like whatever the conversation is around that kind of stuff becomes
when should there be intervention?
Yeah, becomes far more complex, right? And then the church's outreach and influence in a society that is particularly suspicious of us. It's like if we view people as also made in God's image and we confer that value on them, even if it's not reciprocated towards us.
I would say recognize rather than confer, right?
And recognize that God made that. Sure, certainly, good catch. There, if we recognize that, then all of a sudden, that's like it becomes a whole different conversation.
Attitude. I wouldn't have to feel defensive
about anything.
No. That would certainly change my testimony, my witness.
Yep.
Dude, what about healthcare, bro?
Yeah, healthcare is always a harder one to me, right? You and I have.
Do you think we disagree on this?
I don't like the government for a lot of things, right? Like,
okay, so like let me be outright about my conviction. I actually really enjoy, like I'm happy that California takes whatever it is, 3.5, 4.5% out of my paycheck specifically for uninsured healthcare people in the state.
And that's a good thing, but to me the bigger problem in that conversation is like it always comes at the end of a gun, right? It's like this is the only way that government is able to enforce this, right? And so that becomes problematic to me in one sense.
The coercion aspect.
Yeah, coercion is always hard for me to swallow personally, just because of the idea of what I see in Scripture, right? Of God desiring choice, and we would read that differently, obviously.
Yes.
But the conversation about that is. That's not to say it's not necessary. I think it is necessary that we do that now, that the government takes that role, because churches have largely failed in living out their convictional call.
Okay, say more about that.
Well, I think this will be the big thing that God
inflammatory.
kind of dings the American church on in general. I'll use one brief kind of example. 4 churches that I know of all share 4 corners of 4 different streets, right? So you can, if you stand here, you can see this church, this church, and this church. Yeah, it's like the 4 states, but it's just 4 churches in an area not too far from me. They don't work together on anything. Their congregations don't overlap. There's not a lot of hanging out. There's not a lot of conversation pieces going on about how they can team up and pool resources and blah, 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 blah. And that drives me up the wall.
That's interesting.
Because I think it's the perfect picture of what the majority of American churches are like as a whole. And I think this will be a thing that God really gets pissed at us for, is like this lack of ability to pool our resources to take care of things, right? So I think government is necessary in this world now because the church has failed. I just don't like the coercion part of it.
Interesting.
But I think, that gap's got to be made up somewhere. And so God's basically saying like, hey, if the church isn't willing to do it, like we'll make it happen. Kind of
yeah. I mean, I get that. And that's interesting to me because I don't know where I would draw the line.
Yeah, for sure. That's a hard one.
That's a hard one.
Rehabilitation ministries get taken more seriously, right? Substance abuse victims, addicts, criminals, domestic violence, sexual violence survivors, like all of a sudden the NIMBY, Christians who are part of like the not in my backyard kind of thing. Like we don't want these like rehab facilities built. We don't want homeless shelters built. Like all of a sudden it would be like YIMBY, right? Like yes, in my backyard becomes a thing where if we saw people with that level of
importance, like what if we saw the rehabilitation of criminals with as much importance as we saw like education?
Yeah, it would be huge. It'd be huge.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it'd be a whole different world we live in.
And this is all coming from understanding a little deeper the doctrine of what God has made humanity to be.
Yep, absolutely. Go ahead.
This is a tricky one, but I want to get to it. What about conversations of identity? Of Now, not limited to gender identity,
Shouldn't.
but including something like that.
Yeah.
How would those conversations change if we started from maker, made, creator, creation, not self-made, not self-identifying or self-conferring?
Yeah, I think it would move us in a direction that was far more humble about these conversations, right? Like, ultimately, my experience...
In both ways?
Yeah, probably. I don't see this as much... specifically in gender identity, right? My experience is I don't see the need for humility to come from the transgender side of that as often, right? I think there's, and again, we're not talking like the fringes of like the social media people, but I'm talking about people who I know personally who are trans, aren't very like high horse about their identity, right? I think this is more of a conversation about the way that the church reacts to these conversations that are happening. I think the church has a propensity to kind of run into their castle and try and like fortify their defenses a little bit. Like man, woman only. Like if we saw them with this image of God kind of marker as like the primary source, I think it would be a lot more like, okay, in the traditional Christian conservative view, it'd be like, we think something is wrong here. We need to try and talk and understand what's going on more before a simple defense fortification.
Holistically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not behavior modification.
Right.
It's not even moral formation.
Right.
It's actual pastoring of people, right?
Yeah. Ironically enough, right? Yeah.
I love that. That's awesome. What else do you think would be really helpful for churches and people to consider, or what are some of the outworkings of this view of a robust view of image of God and humanity?
I think when we begin to live this out, it has such a profound effects on releasing control. And I think this is probably the most important takeaway, right? The year of COVID has shown a lot of churches and a lot of leaders that control is largely illusionary, right? In our perspective, in the way that we feel about things. And so if we incorporate this, doctrine of man reality into our lived experiences, it would remind us from the get that both on a cosmological level, we're not in control, but very often in our personal dynamics, right? There needs to be a releasing of the desire to control its direction. And I think it would give us the opportunity to have deeper conversations sooner, more pastoral conversations more frequently. And I think we'd be able to make a way deeper impact, not just more butts and seats, not just higher giving, not just whatever, not just new buildings or any of that. I think we would be able to be
society.
I think we'd be able to transform our communities around us.
I love that. That's awesome. What do you guys think? How do you think that a deep perspective on the image of God in humanity would change some of these issues, some of the conversations, and our disposition in these conversations? Make sure to leave us a comment. Make sure to check out the JUCE TV app and check out all of these episodes. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time on Kingdom Thinking.